Despite that, a party such as the EFF, with its brilliant marketing, a shrewd leadership, a clear message, you can't be in any doubt as to what it stands for, you can't not be aware that it exists, has struggled to hold support levels north of 10%. And that's been a sort of apparent contradiction in the country. How's that possible? You have this massive number of desperately poor people, young people with access to information, social media, that could easily be radicalized, and yet the EFF is unable to achieve that. Chief reason for that.
So according to Dr. Frans Cronje, the EFF is losing a lot of votes. Actually, he explained earlier that the MK party, especially with the entrance of Zuma, is actually one big reason why the EFF is losing a lot of votes. But in this video, he's actually explaining the major reason why the EFF seems not to be having a growth that is beyond 10% in its accumulation of the votes from the electorate. Let's listen to what he has to say about the EFF's vote placement in the South Africa's elections coming up soon. And we'll be back for an interesting analysis.
There's one point that maybe is worth reflecting on. Even before the entrance of the MK party, the EFF seems to have, over these years, just hit a ceiling at around 10%. And maybe you could explain that, because let's say in a country where there is dissatisfaction with the ANC, people have not moved to the EFF. What's been holding that back? I mean, they still stuck at around that 10%, and now you say they're even below that.
Okay, we've covered one, what I call countervailing force in favor of the country's success, which is that our democratic system works exactly as intended, and we're fortunate that that's the case. Second countervailing force is what you lead me to here. About 70% of young people in South Africa do not have a job, which is massive levels of contemporary economic exclusion. Despite that, a party such as the EFF, with its brilliant marketing, a shrewd leadership, a clear message, you can't be in any doubt as to what it stands for, you can't not be aware that it exists, has struggled to hold support levels north of 10%. And that's been a sort of apparent contradiction in the country. How's that possible? You have this massive number of desperately poor people, young people with access to information, social media, that could easily be radicalized, and yet the EFF is unable to achieve that. Chief reason for that is that public opinion in South Africa is immensely moderate, centrist and pragmatic. A comfortable 8 out of 10 South Africans are with each other. They respect each other across lines of race and class and history and politics. They have the same desires for their kids and for their families. They want to come to cities. They want to live in safe neighborhoods. They want to send their children to good schools. They want to work so they can care for their families. And they want to accumulate wealth and assets. We are not a radicalized populace. And that is the reason why the radical populists have yet to make considerable inroads into the country's politics. In the fullness of time, that might, of course, change. If we squander this opportunity of this election and the administration that comes after it to actually address the real needs of millions of desperately poor South Africans, there's no telling what might happen in the future. But over the past 30 years, and in fact before that, because there's excellent data that exists through the 70s and the 80s even, and into the 90s. And for the foreseeable future, public opinion is moderate and centrist. And if we can capitalize on that, we have a serious prospect of realizing a much more successful long-term horizon for the country. It's a very different kind of problem, therefore, we face politically to if we were a country in which youth opinion had been radicalized in pursuit of destructive and populist ideals. If that was the case, it would be very difficult for me to sit here and tell you that into the medium term there is a realistic prospect for the country to be a success. We are fortunate again that we're not yet at that point.
Yeah, so what do you guys think? I think it's a really interesting one. I learned a lot of new things from his speech today, a lot of new things. And especially from the perspective that he argues that South Africa is not a radicalized populace, you see. So the general opinion of South Africa, of the South African populace isn't radicalized. And as a result, it seems that the EFF's message seems to be attracting quite a huge portion of the populace of South Africa, but not the totality, and that's why its voter number, the voter percentage of the populace, seems to be hitting a certain ceiling. And it's really interesting because the term radicalization is really important to really understand. And I found some interesting studies from the Center of Study of Violence and Reconciliation from one Masana in Dinga. And I think this researcher really places this whole understanding of radicalization and de-radicalization in a very interesting light. But first and foremost, I think it's also important to understand what it means for a populace to be radicalized. What does it really mean that the South African populace is not a radicalized populace? So if we get easily on Science Direct and we try to understand why people radicalize, a really interesting article on Science Direct actually speaks about the fact that radicalization begins with a sense of displacement from the mainstream institutions and particularly from formal education, okay? And it begins with a mentor. So the mentor, in person or online, replaces institutional actors and other sources of knowledge to become a guide through transformative and experiential learning. So this is how radicalization begins, and then slowly it spreads through across a large number of people. And in South Africa, I think 50 million people thereabout, it then spreads through and accumulates a whole large mass of the entire populace of South Africa. So it says that while the mentor replaces the institutional and the institutional actors and other sources of knowledge to guide the people towards a certain form of revolution or the direction of that radicalization, the replacement has a possibility to turn into radicalizing education, where extremist narratives subversively minimize the relevance of formal institutions, educations, and teachers. So this is what a radicalization should achieve. A radicalization naturally achieves a sort of like a replacement through a certain message by the mentor of this radicalization, that it replaces institutions of learning, dominant institutions of learning and teaching with the message of that radicalization. Okay, and with that the effervescence of a radical populace then takes off. Right. So according to Dr. Frans Cronje in this video, it seems that South Africa hasn't been able to get to that stage yet because South Africa is a really educated population. I found out from a research I conducted earlier on that South Africa has a 95.5% literacy rate across males and females. You see, so the literacy rate in South Africa is really high. So it would really take a lot for this kind of radicalization to take place easily across the entire populace, because South Africans are thinking people. South Africans are people who think and understand and critically analyze arguments and points of views before coming into a natural conclusion. I think it would be one of the major tenets of a really of an effective space for democracy to flourish, is that there's a really thinking populace that can really analyze and come to logical conclusions before taking in logical analysis before coming to conclusions. And so that's the character of the South African populace. And according to Dr. Frans Cronje, that seems to be a stumbling block to the success of the EFF, and especially the EFF's policies, which are, land expropriation without compensation and nationalization of banks and mines and all that. So this is the message, and it's really not having its message pass across to the wider populace because of the fact that the South African populace is not radicalized. Okay, so let's quickly now jump to another, this study. I found this one really interesting, and this researcher from the study of violence and reconciliation takes this whole argument of radicalization from a perspective of extremism. Okay, and they define extremism in the context of the post-apartheid South Africa, which is extremism in post-apartheid South Africa now refers to a mode of communication about an underlying experience driven by social, economic, political, and religious views. Now, this is the character of extremism in post-apartheid South Africa, not the extremism that is really spoken a lot about in the media, about which has a religious undertone. But in post-apartheid South Africa, it has to do with an underlying experience of social, economic, and political, and also religious views. Okay, so in post-apartheid South Africa, those characterized as extremists often experience multiple levels of marginalization and have complex relationships with vertical and horizontal power structures. So extremism then is a mode of mobilization around that marginalization. The argument that follows is that addressing violent extremism in post-apartheid South Africa means addressing the conditions that make it a viable mode of communication in what this researcher speaks about as a social contract. Okay, so radicalization right now in South Africa, especially if we take it from the perspective of extremism, has to do with arguments that speak of a marginalization between a relationship between state and society, what this researcher speaks about as social contract. Now here they say that the social contract is an agreement between states and society on their mutual roles, rights, and relationships. And in post-apartheid South Africa, service delivery and the realization of rights, justice, and equity from a large part of the populace actually then speaks to that social contract. And especially this stems from the perspective of rainbowism. Okay, so the currency of rainbowism is intricately linked to the capacity of the state to deliver services to all the people of South Africa. So the fact that the state is unable to deliver services to certain groups of people leads to a fractured cohesion. So this now defines the character of radicalization in South Africa that the the EFF might need to probably capitalize on to probably get its votes higher than the ceiling is experiencing at the moment. So in other words, what extremism means in post-apartheid South Africa, and I like how they put it here, that extremism in South Africa does not exist in a vacuum. It is intimately linked to the perceptions of the state, the self, and the other. It originates from the fault lines of social, economic, and political exclusion. So extremism, radicalization in South Africa, especially among the populace, isn't widespread because there's a portion of the South African populace that doesn't seem to be experiencing the effects of this political and social exclusion from the social contract between the state and the people as much as some other people experience that. And so as a result, any radicalization message in South Africa might not hold footing because a large portion of the populace, according to these definitions and discussions, isn't really feeling this exclusion from a social contract, especially what the state should be providing as service delivery to the people. And this is, according to Dr. Frans Cronje, one of the reasons why the EFF seems to be struggling with its vote at the moment, because radicalization in this sense would have to mean the fact that there's a common message across a really wider percentage of the populace that speaks to a fracture of the social contract between the state and the populace for a radical message as like the message of the EFF to take root. And as a result of the fact that critical mass hasn't been reached, especially in terms of exclusions from the rainbow concept in that regard, especially from these definitions, then the radical message from a radical party, you know, such as the EFF, isn't taking root. And this is his own concept, his explanation of why the EFF isn't getting as much votes as it should be getting in this moment, especially in this election. And it will spell this fact would spell a lot of consequences and impact on whichever party ends up becoming the majority in the elections. Because if the ANC then gets probably a minority in a way where it has to work with an a coalition, then it speaks of how the governance of South Africa, the governance structure of South Africa will change a lot, you know, especially if the DA concedes to that, and then the DA now loses its state as the major opposition, but then has to work around these other groups to form a coalition. And in another video, Dr. Frans Cronje speaks about how this election might be a major threat. I'm going to upload that video. It might be a major threat to the DA's position as the main opposition in South Africa. And so it's really interesting times though. But I don't know, what do you guys think about his speech here in this video? Really interesting concept, really interesting idea. Share your thoughts in the comments.